Ethan Miller never fit in. At 16, he had long accepted that he was invisible at best and a joke at worst. Every step he took down the high school hallways was another chance for someone to remind him of what he was: a fat, slow, easy target. He had mastered the art of keeping his head down, of making himself small despite his size, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't disappear. Lunch was the worst part of the day. The cafeteria was a war zone where the strong devoured the weak, and Ethan, he was fresh meat. He moved cautiously between tables, balancing his tray, already anticipating the worst. The moment he passed by Dylan Carter's table, he knew he'd made a mistake. Dylan Carter was everything Ethan wasn't: tall, athletic, effortlessly cool. The school's star quarterback, son of a former NFL player, and the undisputed king of Oak Ridge High. He didn't just walk the hallways. He owned them, and for reasons Ethan didn't understand, Dylan had made it his mission to make his life hell. A foot shot out. Ethan barely had time to register what was happening before his world tilted. His tray flew from his hands, the food splattering across the floor as he crashed down hard, his knee slamming into the cold tile. The cafeteria went silent for half a second before the laughter erupted. "Jesus, Miller!" Dylan's voice rang out, dripping with fake concern. "You trying to take out the whole cafeteria? Gotta warn us before you bring down the house." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, his ears burning. He should have been used to this by now, but somehow it still stung every time. He scrambled to his feet, reaching for his tray, but Dylan's foot landed on it, pinning it down. "Leave it," Dylan said, smirking. "Maybe you should skip a meal anyway." The laughter cut through Ethan like a knife. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to say something, do something, but what? If he fought back, it would only get worse. If he walked away, it would never stop. Before he could decide, a hand grabbed his arm. Sarah Mitchell. She was one of the only people in school who didn't actively participate in his humiliation, but she never stopped it either. "Come on," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward Dylan's table. Ethan hesitated, but let her pull him away. Behind him, Dylan laughed, calling after him, "That's right, run along. Maybe next time, bring a helmet." Ethan didn't speak as Sarah led him out of the cafeteria, the echoes of laughter chasing after him. Once they were in the hallway, she let go of his arm, looking guilty. I just thought you needed to get out of there." "I'm fine," Ethan muttered, though they both knew it was a lie. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "See you in class." She walked away, and Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at the ground. He felt like a walking punchline, a joke that never stopped being funny. And the worst part, he was starting to believe it. By the time the final bell rang, Ethan's mood had soured into something darker. He moved through the hallways like a ghost, ignoring the occasional snickers and whispers. His body ached from the fall, but the pain in his chest was worse. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he wandered, his feet carrying him without thought. Eventually, he found himself in the school's empty locker room. The silence was heavy, pressing against his skin. He walked to the mirror above the sinks and stared at his reflection. He hated what he saw: the round face, the thick arms, the stomach that no hoodie could hide. Dylan's words echoed in his head. "Maybe you should skip a meal anyway." His breath came faster, his heart hammering against his ribs. Without thinking, he slammed his fist into the mirror's edge. Pain shot up his arm, but it was nothing compared to the frustration burning inside him. He gritted his teeth, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. "Why the hell am I like this?" he whispered. He didn't hear the locker room door open. "That's a good question," a voice said. Ethan spun around, startled. A guy stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He was older, maybe 17 or 18, lean but muscular. His dark hair was messy, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite pity, but close. "Who the hell are you?" Ethan asked, still breathing heavily. Jake, the guy said. Jake Ramirez, I saw what happened in the cafeteria. Ethan tensed. If you're here to tell me how pathetic I am, get in line. Jake tilted his head. That's not what I was gonna say. He took a step closer, his gaze sharp. I was gonna say, you look pissed. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. No shit. Jake nodded, as if considering something. Good. You should be pissed, but tell me something. What are you gonna do about it? Ethan frowned. What? You gonna keep punching mirrors? Jake asked. Or you want to actually learn how to fight back? Ethan froze. The words were like a match struck in the dark. Fight? Jake smirked. Yeah. You ever heard of Ramirez Boxing Gym? Of course he had. It was a small gym in town, run by an ex-fighter who had trained some of the best boxers in the area, but Ethan had never imagined stepping foot inside it. Why? Jake shrugged. Because you've got something in you, man. I saw it. That anger, that's power. But right now you don't know how to use it. Ethan hesitated. His whole life he had been told he wasn't built for sports. He was too slow, too heavy, too weak. But what if that wasn't true? Jake saw the hesitation and took a step back. Look, I'm not saying you're gonna be some overnight champ, but you want this to stop? You want Dylan to stop walking all over you? Ethan swallowed hard. Yeah, then meet me at the gym tomorrow. Jake turned to leave, then glanced back. Or don't. Up to you. And then he was gone. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding for a different reason now. He turned back to the mirror, staring at himself. For the first time in a long time, he saw something different. Not just the fat kid, not just the joke. A fighter, maybe. Ethan hesitated outside Ramirez Boxing Gym, his heart hammering like a drum in his chest. The building wasn't impressive, just a worn-down brick structure with a faded sign above the entrance. The windows were covered in dust, and from inside, he could hear the rhythmic pounding of fists against heavy bags, the sharp commands of a trainer, and the low murmur of voices. It smelled like sweat and old leather, a scent foreign to him, but strangely intoxicating. For a brief second, doubt crept in. He didn't belong here. This place was for real fighters, guys who had muscle, speed, and a history of throwing punches. Not for someone like him. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should just turn around and, are you going to stand out there all day, or are you coming in? Ethan turned to see Jake leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smirk playing. At the edge of his lips, he looked like he'd been expecting Ethan to hesitate. Ethan swallowed, shoving his hands into the pocket of his hoodie. I don't know if this is a good idea, Jake scoffed. Yeah, well, neither did I when I started. But standing outside ain't gonna teach you how to throw a punch. Get in here. Before Ethan could talk himself out of it, Jake turned and walked inside. Ethan took a deep breath and followed. The gym was smaller than he expected, but it was alive with movement. Boxers of all sizes and skill levels were training, some hitting the speed bag in a rapid blur of motion, others sparring in the ring, their gloved fists colliding with muffled thuds. A massive man with grey-streaked hair and a scar running down his left cheek stood by the ring, barking orders in a voice that could cut through steel. That had to be Hector Ramirez, the owner, ex-pro fighter and local legend. Ethan barely had time to take it all in before Jake tossed a pair of hand wraps at him. First lesson, wrap your hands. If you don't, you're gonna break something. Ethan fumbled with the fabric, trying to mimic what Jake was doing. It looked simple enough, just winding the wraps around his wrists, over his knuckles, and back again. But somehow his fingers felt clumsy, and the wraps ended up too loose. Jake sighed and grabbed Ethan's hand. Jesus, man, you're not mummifying yourself. Here, like this. He rewrapped Ethan's hands with quick, practiced movements, tightening the fabric just enough. You're gonna need to learn this on your own. But for now, let's get to the fun part. Ethan followed him to a heavy bag hanging from the ceiling. Jake gave it a solid punch, making it swing slightly. All right, first rule, your power comes from your legs, not just your arms. If you're swinging just with your upper body, you're gonna hit like a kid throwing a tantrum. Ethan hesitated, then threw a punch. It landed awkwardly, his knuckles scraping against the rough surface. The bag barely moved. Jake snorted. That was adorable. Try again. Frustration flared in Ethan's chest. He clenched his teeth and swung harder. The bag moved a little more, but his wrist buckled slightly, sending pain shooting up his arm. He hissed and shook it out. Jake raised an eyebrow. All right, so that was terrible. But hey, nobody's good their first day. Yeah, no kidding. Ethan muttered, flexing his fingers. Look, Jake said, stepping in front of him. You've got size, which means when you get this right, you're gonna hit like a damn freight train. But you need control. You need balance. And most of all, you need to stop thinking that just because you're big, you're automatically strong. Ethan wanted to snap back, but the truth in Jake's words stung too much. Instead, he just nodded. For the next hour, Jake drilled him. Stance, footwork, basic combinations. Ethan's muscles screamed in protest. His breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes. He had never worked his body this hard in his life. But with every strike against the heavy bag, every bead of sweat that fell to the floor, something inside him started to shift. The rage he had carried for so long, the humiliation, the self-hatred, the endless cycle of being the joke, was beginning to take shape into something else. Determination. By the time Jake finally called for a break, Ethan's arms felt like jelly. He collapsed onto a bench, gulping down water like he'd been stranded in the desert. Every inch of him ached, but for some reason, he didn't hate it. You didn't die, Jake said, leaning against the bench with a grin. That's a good start. Ethan wiped his face with his sleeve. Barely, Jake chuckled. You'll get used to it, or you'll quit. Most do. I'm not quitting. The words left Ethan's mouth before he even realized he meant them. Jake studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. Good, then be here tomorrow. Same time. Ethan's entire body protested the idea, but his heart had already decided. I'll be here. He wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or adrenaline still surging through his veins. But as he walked out of the gym that night, for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Ethan's body was in a constant state of soreness. Every morning, he woke up feeling like he'd been hit by a truck, and every night he crawled into bed with muscles that screamed in protest. But he kept showing up. Day after day, he pushed through the pain, ignoring the burn in his lungs, the ache in his legs, and the bruises forming across his knuckles. He didn't just want this. He needed it. The gym had become his second home. The smell of sweat and old leather, the rhythmic pounding of gloves against bags, and the gruff commands of Hector Ramirez, the gym's owner, were now familiar, almost comforting. Hector barely acknowledged Ethan at first, letting Jake handle his training, but that changed the day Ethan refused to quit. It was during a brutal conditioning drill. Hector had them doing non-stop combinations on the heavy bags. No breaks. Sweat dripped into Ethan's eyes. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his arms felt like dead weight. His body screamed at him to stop, to just collapse onto the floor and give in. But then he thought about Dylan, about the cafeteria, about the way people looked at him like he was nothing, and something inside him snapped. He gritted his teeth and kept swinging. When the drill finally ended, most of the guys in the gym were bent over, gasping for air. Ethan was drenched in sweat, barely standing, but he hadn't stopped. He hadn't quit. Hector, who had been silently observing from the corner, walked over, arms crossed. "You're stubborn," he said. Ethan wiped the sweat from his face. "Is that a good thing?" Hector gave a short nod. Depends. If you're just too dumb to know when to quit, it's useless. But if you know why you're pushing yourself, then yeah, it's a good thing. He studied Ethan for a moment, then turned to Jake. Put him in the ring next week. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Wait, what? Jake grinned. Congrats, man, you're sparring next week. Ethan's stomach twisted. He'd been training for weeks, but the idea of stepping into the ring, of actually fighting someone, made his pulse skyrocket. Jake clapped him on the shoulder. Relax, you'll be fine, just don't die. That wasn't exactly reassuring. The week leading up to the sparring match was hell. Jake intensified Ethan's training, pushing him harder than ever. His footwork had to be sharper, his punches cleaner, his defense tighter. Every night, he left the gym exhausted, barely able to lift his arms, but he refused to stop. He couldn't. The night before the fight, he sat in his room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He didn't look the same. His face was leaner, his posture stronger. He had lost weight, but more importantly, he had gained something else. Confidence. But was it enough? The next evening, Ethan stood in the ring, his gloves tightened, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him, the gym was quiet, the usual chatter replaced with focused stares. His opponent was a guy named Marco, a lean, fast fighter who had been training for years. Ethan felt like a lumbering giant in comparison. Jake leaned in, his voice low. Stay calm, protect yourself, and whatever you do, don't freeze. Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. The bell rang. Marco moved fast. Before Ethan could even register it, a jab snapped his head back. He stumbled, barely catching his footing. The gym blurred around him. Hands up! Jake shouted. Ethan raised his guard just as another punch came. He blocked it, but Marco was relentless, weaving in and out of range, throwing combinations too. Fast for Ethan to react. Panic clawed at his chest. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything. But all he could think about was how slow he was, how out of his depth he felt. He was getting beaten, and everyone was watching. And then he heard Dylan's voice in his head. Maybe you should skip a meal anyway. Something inside Ethan snapped. He set his feet, exhaled sharply, and threw a right hook with everything he had. It connected. Marco's head jerked sideways, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flash of surprise in his opponent's eyes. The gym let out a collective, "Oh!" Marco recovered quickly, but Ethan had felt it, his power. He wasn't weak. He wasn't just a joke. He had something real. Marco came at him again, but this time Ethan didn't back down. He started moving, dodging, countering. He wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. The round ended, and Ethan staggered back to his corner, gasping for air. Jake grinned. Now that's what I'm talking about. Hector gave him a nod from across the ring. Not bad, kid. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He hadn't won, but he had proved something to himself. He wasn't just the fat kid anymore, and this was only the beginning. Ethan sat on the locker room bench, his gloves resting on his knees, his breath still heavy from the sparring session. His knuckles throbbed, his ribs ached from the body shots Marco had landed, but none of that mattered. He had held his own, in the ring. He hadn't backed down. For the first time, he felt like he belonged here. Jake walked in, tossing a towel onto Ethan's lap. Not bad, Miller. Thought you were going to piss yourself in the first 30 seconds, but you pulled it. Together, Ethan let out a tired chuckle, wiping sweat from his face. Yeah, well, I almost did. Jake smirked. Figured, but you took a hit and kept going. That's what matters. He sat on the bench across from him, lacing up his own gloves. Now comes the hard part. Ethan frowned. This wasn't the hard part? Jake shook his head. Nah, this was the fun part. The hard part is when you start doubting yourself, when the hits keep coming and you don't think you can take any more. That's when most guys quit. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. You gonna quit? Ethan met his eyes and shook his head. No. Good, Jake said, standing. Because you've got a real fight coming. Ethan stiffened. What? Jake gave him a knowing look. You think Dylan's just gonna sit back and watch you get stronger? He's not the type to let things slide. He's gonna come for you. And when he does, you'd better be ready. Ethan swallowed hard. He hadn't seen much of Dylan in the past few weeks. The usual cafeteria humiliations had stopped. The shoving in the hallways had disappeared. But that didn't mean it was over. Dylan wasn't the kind of guy to let things go. The next day at school, that thought became reality. Ethan was heading to his locker when he heard the familiar voice behind him. "Hey, Miller." He turned to see Dylan leaning against the lockers, his usual smirk in place, but there was something different this time, a sharpness in his eyes, something colder. "I hear you've been training," Dylan said. "Think you're tough now?" Ethan took a slow breath. His pulse was quick, but he kept his face neutral. "I don't think anything," Dylan chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, see, I think you do. I think you're starting to believe your own hype." He pushed off the locker and stepped closer. "So let's settle this. You and me, one-on-one, a real fight." Ethan's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. He knew this was coming. He just hadn't expected it so soon. "At the gym," Dylan snorted. "Hell no. I'm not stepping into some sweaty dump just to mess you up." He leaned in. "Friday night, the old warehouse by the train tracks. No rules, no refs." A pit formed in Ethan's stomach. This wasn't just about fighting. Dylan wanted to hurt him. And if he agreed to this, there would be no one to stop it. Before Ethan could respond, another voice cut in. "Are you serious?" Sarah stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes blazing. She looked straight at Dylan. "A street fight? What is this, a bad action movie?" Dylan smirked. "Stay out of it, Mitchell." She stepped closer, unfazed. "Or what? You gonna fight me too?" For a moment, Dylan hesitated. Then he laughed, shaking his head. "You've got a mouth on you. Fine. If Miller's too scared, he can back out, but everyone will know what that means." He turned and walked off, his message clear. If Ethan didn't show up, he'd never hear the end of it. Sarah exhaled sharply, turning to Ethan. "You're not seriously considering this, are you?" Ethan stared at the ground. "If I don't, he won't stop." She ran a hand through her hair, frustrated. "Then fight him in the ring, not in some abandoned building where he can do whatever he wants." Ethan sighed. "You think he'd ever agree to that?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, because he knows he'd lose." That thought stuck with Ethan. Was that true? Was Dylan actually scared of facing him in a fair fight? The idea was almost impossible to believe. That night at the gym, Ethan told Jake about the challenge. Jake's reaction was immediate. "No," Ethan blinked. "What?" Jake's expression was hard. "You're not fighting him in some back alley like a damn idiot. That's not boxing. That's just giving him exactly what he wants. A chance to hurt you with no consequences." "I can't just walk away," Ethan argued. "You don't get it. If I don't show up, it won't stop." Jake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then fight him the right way." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Jake leaned against the ropes of the ring, crossing his arms. "There's a charity event coming up at the gym. Local fighters, amateur matches. Dylan likes attention, right? Challenge him to fight you there. Public place, rules, no cheap shots." Ethan hesitated. "He'll never agree," Jake smirked. "He will if you make it clear backing out makes him look weak." The next day, Ethan found Dylan at lunch. The cafeteria was full, the perfect stage. "You want to fight?" Ethan said, loud enough for people to hear. "Do it in the ring, at the charity event, unless you're afraid." Dylan's smirk faltered for half a second before he covered it with a laugh. "You think you can take me, Miller?" Ethan didn't smile. "I think you won't have the guts to find out." A murmur rippled through the cafeteria. Everyone was watching, waiting. Dylan's jaw tightened. He glanced around, realizing he was cornered. Finally, he shrugged. "Fine. Hope you like losing in front of a crowd." Ethan's heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. We'll see. As Dylan walked away, Sarah appeared beside him. She raised an eyebrow. That was bold, Ethan exhaled. Yeah, let's hope it wasn't stupid. The fight was set, and this time it was on Ethan's terms. The gym was buzzing with energy. Posters for the charity event lined the walls, featuring names of local fighters. But the only matchup people cared about was Ethan Miller versus Dylan Carter. Word had spread fast through the school. By the time Friday night arrived, it felt like the entire student body had shown up, crowding around the ring, eager to witness what was supposed to be a public execution. Ethan sat in the locker room, his hands wrapped tightly, his stomach twisting into knots. He had trained for this. He had pushed himself harder than ever, but none of that stopped the fear clawing at his chest. Dylan wasn't just some random opponent. He was the guy who had humiliated him for years. The guy everyone expected to wipe the floor with him. Jake leaned against the locker beside him, arms crossed. "You ready?" Ethan let out a shaky breath. "I don't know." Jake nodded like he had expected that answer. "Good," Ethan frowned. "Good?" Jake smirked. "Yeah, because if you weren't nervous, I'd think you were stupid." He crouched down in front of Ethan, his expression serious. "Listen, man, you already won the hard part. You got here. You made him step into your world, not the other way around. Now you just have to fight." Ethan nodded slowly, his pulse steadying. A knock on the door signaled it was time. The walk to the ring felt endless. The crowd was loud, the lights blinding. Dylan was already there, bouncing on the balls of his feet, wearing a grin that dripped with arrogance. He was dressed in custom trunks, his name stitched in bold letters across the waistband. Ethan, in contrast, wore plain black shorts. He wasn't here to put on a show. The referee called them to the center. Dylan smirked. "Last chance to back out, Miller." Ethan met his gaze, his voice steady. "Not a chance." The bell rang. Dylan came out fast, just like Ethan had expected. He was aggressive, throwing a sharp jab, testing Ethan's reflexes. Ethan dodged, keeping his guard high, staying patient. Dylan swung again. This time Ethan blocked and countered with a quick shot to the ribs. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to let Dylan know he wasn't just going to be a punching bag. Dylan's expression darkened. He rushed in, feinting left before driving a right hook toward Ethan's face. Ethan barely ducked in time, his breath catching in his throat. He needed to move faster. The first round was a blur of footwork, dodges, and calculated shots. Ethan wasn't winning, but he wasn't losing either. He could hear Jake shouting from the corner, reminding him to breathe, to stay light on his feet. The second round was different. Dylan came out harder, his movements sharper. He started landing more hits, his fists finding their mark against Ethan's ribs, his jaw. A solid shot to the stomach made Ethan stumble, his vision flashing white for a split second. Pain exploded through his body. The crowd roared. For a moment, the old fear crept back in, the fear of being humiliated, of being the joke. Then he saw Sarah in the crowd. She wasn't cheering like the others. She was watching him, eyes fierce, like she was daring him to give up. He wouldn't. Ethan clenched his teeth and straightened. Dylan smirked. "That all you got?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Not even close." Dylan threw another punch, but this time Ethan was ready. He slipped under it and came up with a right hook that connected solidly with Dylan's jaw. The impact sent a shockwave through his arm, and for the first time, Dylan stumbled. The crowd gasped. Ethan pressed forward. Left jab, right hook. Dylan blocked the first but wasn't fast enough for the second. His head snapped back. For the first time ever, Dylan Carter didn't look untouchable. The bell rang, ending the round, but the momentum had shifted. In his corner, Jake grinned. "Now we're talking." Ethan gulped down water, breathing hard. His body ached, but adrenaline kept him upright. The final round came. Dylan was pissed now. He came at Ethan with everything. He had. Fast punches, heavy swings, but Ethan had learned to take a hit, to roll with the impact. And more importantly, he had learned to counter. Dylan threw a wild hook. Ethan ducked, pivoted, and sent a crushing right cross into Dylan's ribs. Dylan gasped, stumbling back, his hands dropping just slightly. That was it. The opening. Ethan took it. A clean uppercut. Dylan hit the mat. The noise in the gym was deafening. The ref started the count. Dylan tried to push himself up, but his arms wobbled. His body wasn't listening to him. The count reached 10. It was over. Ethan had won. The gym was electric. The crowd erupted as the referee raised Ethan's arm, his voice barely audible over the cheers. Sweat dripped down his face, his chest rising and falling with deep, ragged breaths. His knuckles throbbed, his ribs ached. But none of it mattered. He had done it. He had won. Across the ring, Dylan was still on his knees, his hands pressed against the mat as he struggled to get up. The smug arrogance he had worn so easily was gone, replaced by something else. Disbelief. He lifted his head, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. For a moment they just stared at each other. No words, no insults. Just the raw realization that the balance of power had shifted. Ethan stepped back to his corner, where Jake was waiting, grinning ear to ear. "Not bad, Miller," he said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Not bad at all." Ethan let out a shaky laugh, shaking his head. "That was insane," Jake smirked. "Welcome to the fight game." Sarah pushed her way through the crowd, stopping just outside the ropes. "Holy shit," she breathed, eyes wide. "You actually did it." Ethan leaned against the ropes, still catching his breath. "Yeah," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I did." The celebration lasted long into the night. People who had barely spoken to Ethan before patted him on the back, congratulated him, treated him like he was someone worth noticing. It was strange being seen. For the first time, he wasn't just the fat kid or the easy target. He was Ethan Miller, the guy who had knocked out Dylan Carter, but it wasn't about them. It never had been. Later that night, after the gym had emptied out, Ethan sat alone in the locker room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His face was bruised, his lip split, but he barely recognized himself. There was something different. In his eyes, strength. Dylan never approached him after that. There were no more insults, no more shoves in the hallway. When they passed each other at school, there was only silence. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was just resignation, but Ethan didn't care. He hadn't won because he wanted Dylan's approval. He had won because he had finally stopped running from himself. One afternoon, as Ethan was gathering his books from his locker, a familiar voice spoke behind him. "You're not what I thought you were." He turned to see Dylan standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. His jaw was still bruised from the fight, but his eyes held something unexpected. Honesty. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And what did you think I was?" Dylan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Someone who'd always stayed down. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the words settle, feeling their weight. Then finally he said, "Guess you were wrong." Dylan studied him for another second, then nodded slightly before walking away. Ethan watched him go, then turned back to his locker, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he was, and that was all that mattered.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.